Welcome to Notepad. I'm your host Ibrahim Sani. We are broadcasting this live from the All Asia Broadcasting Centre here in Bukit Jalil. We are still unravelling Budget 2022, much of which have been debated in the Parliament. But of course, in the next few days, much more debate will take place regardless of the onslaught of COVID-19 resurgence cases right now. One area of concern, or one area of interest at least, would be on the Finance Minister, Tengku Datuk Sri Zafrul Aziz, saying that although the government's debt ceiling was raised more than 65%, what is more important for the government's ability to repay the loan. And some measures were mentioned by the Finance Minister in the days after he presented the budget, arguing that if we were to pull the brake too fast, where we suddenly don't want to spend or make an expansionary fiscal policy, our economy can't recover faster than expected. This is just the general outlook of what is to be expected, but one area of concern would be on the areas of tax where growth could be stimulated. Here to unpack this is Jennifer Chang of PwC. She's a tax partner there. How are you, Jennifer?
Good, thanks. Hi, Ibrahim.
Yeah, let's talk about that whole notion of the income side of the budget. We know now that about 50% of the budget will be funded by tax, either direct or indirect, and there will be other sources of tax as well. Let's go through all of those areas of tax where growth could be stimulated.
Yeah, so I guess as far as tax is concerned and incentives that we have in Malaysia, it is actually an opportunity for resetting. Malaysia, we have many incentives and this has served the country very well in attracting foreign direct investors, as well as promote Malaysia to foreign direct investments. So I guess when it comes to areas of growth for Malaysia, tax incentives is obviously an area which we could relook at and revamp to see how we can attract foreign direct investors to come into Malaysia, set up operations, and look at our incentives to see whether they are competitive enough and are they targeting the right type of industries and investors. Obviously, transparency is important. Having the correct tax system and having clear rules is also very important. So, this announcement of having the 2 billion fund to attract strategic foreign investments and multinationals would be quite important. That's as far as attracting investments. Now, if you're talking about growth in tax revenue, obviously what was announced on Friday by the Finance Minister talks about several areas of increasing taxes, and this, as you know, will include the 33% tax on income in excess of 100 million, as well as higher rates of stamp duty.
Yeah, let's talk about that a bit because a lot of people have been arguing that this is not a windfall tax, but it certainly behaves that way. How do you see this?
Yeah, so really it is. I don't know whether you want to call it a windfall tax or whether it is a one-off, what they call it, additional taxes for those companies that are obviously doing very well during this pandemic stage. Because the 24% tax is still levied normally on income up to 100 million, and anything above that is 33%. So, of course, if you're a company that's affected by it, you may be a bit taken aback because, that's a 9% increase in your taxes, yeah? But again, it is only once off, and I hope it is only once off. Because we also need to be competitive in the region. And if you look around Asia Pacific, our tax rate of 24% as it is, may not be the highest, but it's not the lowest either. So you obviously can't have a 33% tax for too long because it will make us uncompetitive. But I guess for a short term, there's a need to fund some of these announcements in the budget, and that's what they have decided to do.
Let's talk a little bit more about where it comes from, this budget. Direct tax 35%, indirect 13%, other direct taxes 4%. So in total, more than 50%. What interests me is, of course, the borrowings and use of government assets at 30% and non-tax revenue at 19%. How do you think this is going to address the narrow revenue base by the government, as we've seen, at the same time, compare and contrast this with the general overview that the deficit is going to be narrowed from 6.5% to 6.0%. How do you think the government is going to resolve this whole issue of tax being narrowed because of the non-implementation of the GST, for instance?
Yeah. So obviously, I think as a short term, there is this, we just talked about this additional tax at 33%, as well as the stamp duty rates going up and all that. So in the short term, over the next 1 year, obviously that will help in the government income. But, you know, in the long term, you know, there needs to be a broadening of the tax base, right? It can't be long term where you have some of these short term type of initiatives. So in the long term, there's a need to see, you know, how best the government can collect more tax revenue. And I think that's where tax education comes in. We have a shadow economy, what they call the grey economy. You know, there's a need to, for example, educate people what their, you know, sort of like obligations are in paying taxes, you know, as rakyats. You know, the tax authorities need to have a program in place to educate the public, to educate businesses that there's a need to pay the taxes, as well as consider other types of taxes in future. You know, I know that GST is obviously not very popular when it was implemented a few years back. But, you know, if GST were to come back, then obviously the lessons learned in the past will need to be you know, sort of implemented in a new system, perhaps start the GST rate at a lower rate of 4% instead of 6%, for example. And the efficiency of refunding people the input tax credits would also be important. Also, I think what they have announced on Friday also is some of the other initiatives like a special voluntary disclosure for indirect tax, where, you know, taxpayers can go over to the customs and volunteer to pay the additional taxes that, you know, maybe you've gotten certain returns incorrect or wrong. You can actually go to the authorities to volunteer and suffer less penalties. So if you look at the previous special voluntary disclosure scheme for income tax during 2018-2019, that actually helped the government to collect at least 8 billion of additional tax revenue. So I think some of these things.
Yeah, go on. Sorry.
Yeah, so some of these things obviously will need to be implemented short term as well as long term. You know, and some of the new taxes, as I mentioned, it could be goods and services tax could come back. It probably needs to be revamped to make it more efficient. You know, and you know, one of those areas that I think the budget talked a lot about is environmental, social, and governance as well. ESG is such a hot topic these days. ESG globally, everyone's talking about it as well. And I'm sure you've heard that, you know, all around the world, carbon tax is something that a lot of countries have implemented. Yeah. Europe has a carbon tax for the last 16 years. 78 countries have some form of carbon tax. In Asia, you're talking about Singapore and Japan that has this carbon tax. You know, so that's another area which in future could be considered, especially ESG being a hot topic.
Yeah. Sorry, Jennifer, that was exactly the question that I was about to ask you, because COP26 right now is currently happening anyway in Glasgow, Scotland, and carbon tax is the first step to actually address the so-called hidden social cost of carbon emissions. It is intended to make visible the hidden cost which otherwise would not have been felt or felt in indirect ways, like more severe weather events, for instance. In instituting, say, for instance, the GST or the carbon tax, there's also that socio-political argument whether or not it's possible to get it done in the first place. Do you feel that the political argument here is going to favor towards all these other sources of revenue, like carbon tax, like GST, knowing very well that it might not go down popular amongst the people for any government of the day to implement?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, any tax is not popular, especially when it's first mooted. So I think there needs to be a lot of engagement with stakeholders, with the public, about such of these new taxes, and probably when it's first implemented, to get people to get used to such new taxes by starting small first. For example, in Singapore, if you're talking about carbon taxes, it's imposed at 5 ringgit Sing dollars per metric ton until 2023. And if you look at even Japan, it's actually imposed at about 10 ringgit 80 cents per metric ton as well. And even in Europe, where Sweden is the highest, of course, at euro 116 per metric ton, you also have on the other scale, Poland, which is actually at 7 euros per metric ton as well. So I think these are the sort of taxes where if you want to start, you may want to actually educate the public, get people used to the idea, and start small so that people get used to it. And of course, it's never going to be extremely popular, but I think if you do it in a very fair way, and make it an efficient way to collect taxes, and transparency is very important in terms of what happens to those taxes once it's collected. Are there actually programs to ensure that the areas that are invested into include, for example, the green economy, and to protect the environment.
All right, Jennifer, we'll go for one short break. When we come back, we'll discuss a little bit more, particularly when it comes to the deficit of the budget. We'll be right back after these messages.
Internet yang perlahan dan tidak stabil mengganggu operasi perniagaan? Biar kami bantu dengan fiber perniagaan Maxis. Internet pantas dan stabil dengan sandaran 4G tanpa wayar. Pastikan perniagaan anda terus maju dengan rangkaian teras MEF 3.0 yang diperakui dan bantuan pakar. Tukar ke fiber perniagaan Maxis hari ini.
Nikmati penjimatan 50% dengan penyelesaian perniagaan Unify.
Ayuh keluarga Malaysia, kita bulatkan tekad dan bersatu hati untuk terus memelihara serta mempertahankan kedaulatan negara. Sebagai keluarga Malaysia yang besar, kita harus bertoleransi dalam semua perkara. Hormat menghormati serta mengekalkan perpaduan rakyat yang berbilang kaum, agama dan bangsa, serta integrasi nasional silang budaya adalah tunjang kekuatan kita sebagai sebuah negara bangsa yang berjaya. Umpama selembar benang dikait, ditenun dan dijalin, akhirnya menjadi kain yang sempurna indah.
Welcome back to Notepad. I have Jennifer Chang of PwC Live right now on the line. Jennifer, to continue on our conversation, we need to talk about some of the more interesting ideas of the government introducing one of Cukai Makmur to try to increase revenues. Government's, of course, borrowing as well to get a little bit more into the coffer. What are your thoughts when it comes to Cukai Makmur as well as government issuing debt or bonds, in this case Suku, to raise debt even further?
Yeah, I think as far as Cukai Makmur is concerned, obviously it's a 9% increase in taxes for companies that are making 100 million ringgit or above. So what happens here is that income up to 100 million will be taxed normally at a normal corporate tax rate of 24%. And anything above 100 million will be taxed at 33%. So it's a 9% increase. Obviously, it's going to impact upon the larger companies out there. To me, I feel that it's a very bold move to announce something like that. It's obviously meant to be for 1 year only. And to a certain extent, I feel that it's a very short-term measure to help the government collect more revenue. It obviously can't be implemented on a long-term basis because, if you have such a high rate of taxes and, our regional neighbors have got the tax rates that are so much lower, people may shift to other countries. So that's why I feel it is really a short-term measure, a stopgap measure for that 1 year. And thereafter, there's really a need to think about, what are the other areas that the government can do to increase revenue. Obviously, there is a need to borrow to fund some of these initiatives that the government has actually announced on Friday.
The government, of course, also intends to introduce the Fiscal Responsibility Act next year with the aim of improving governance, accountability and transparency in the country's fiscal management system to ensure fiscal sustainability and to support macroeconomic stability. Do you feel that the FRA or the Fiscal Responsibility Act will instill good discipline in terms of fiscal management? And how do you think this will give confidence into how tax is collected and, of course, managed?
Yeah, I think it's a good move to have the Fiscal Responsibility Act because, it actually instills good discipline in terms of fiscal management. So, it gives the public confidence that, tax collections are properly channeled and managed well. And, for all of us, our hard-earned, salary and earnings, we at least know how, the projects that are being funded by the tax revenue is being spent. For example, whether there's discipline in this spending, how effective it is, and the transparency to the public about how that's being done. And I think more importantly is that quality projects need to be invested from the tax collections so that at least we know that tax revenue collection has been put to good use and has been effectively managed. So what I understand from the Fiscal Responsibility Act also is on top of coming up with the act, there will be committees set up and these committees will meet very often. They will go through the projects, they will actually follow up on the project. So I think it's a good move to give at least more confidence to taxpayers.
One area of concern is, of course, stimulating the SME, particularly the micro SME. The Finance Minister, in his budget presentation on Friday, did repeatedly ask or present ideas on how to stimulate this area. One such area, of course, is to carry forward unabsorbed business loans, where it can be carried forward for 10 consecutive years of assessment. Another area, of course, is trying to establish greater funds or assistance towards this particular sector. Do you feel that these kind of measures, i.e. taking less from them in terms of tax and giving more in terms of stimulus, can actually boost the growth of this sector even further for 2022?
Yeah, I think to a certain extent, what has been announced will essentially be helping the small and medium enterprises because, as you may be aware, with all the lockdowns and not being able to operate, a lot of businesses have suffered. So some of these initiatives are welcome, obviously. But again, in a long-term basis, I think there's more that needs to be done. Upskilling, the government also talked about upskilling of employees. They have funds to actually help in the training of people. So I think it has to go hand in hand as well, not just about giving some of these incentives, which in the short term will help the SMEs, but I think in the long run, there's also a need to actually upskill the people in these organizations, training, and also there was also something talked about automation as well. Funds were actually set aside to actually help some of these industries automate themselves as well. So I think it has to be a medium-term type of initiative where you help to boost the abilities of these small and medium enterprises.
Speaking about medium-term goals, one area, of course, is the tax expenditure statement. Do you feel that this is something that needs to be well lauded? In fact, if you look at countries that do, have a proper statement or accountability in terms of public finance, New Zealand, for instance, if you just Google tax expenditure statement, you can easily retrieve it. Of course, they've been moving on to a closed system for the longest of time, actually. But do you think that we're heading towards the right direction when it comes to accountability and transparency when it comes to tax expenditure statements as per mooted by the Finance Minister in his budget presentation?
Yeah, I think definitely. I think the world is becoming more and more transparent. You find that for whether it's governments coming up with statistics to the public, or it could be organizations, corporates that actually provide some form of information about the taxes that they pay, their strategies, the governance. I think it's becoming more and more important. And generally, there is awareness among the public about the need for some of these governments and organizations to be transparent as well. So I think it's definitely in the right direction.
Two areas I want to touch some more before we end this, conclude this conversation. The first, of course, is the Special Voluntary Disclosure Program, or SVDP, for indirect tax. The indirect tax for the Special Disclosure program will be introduced by the Royal Malaysian Customs Department in phases, and there will be some penalty remission of up to 100% that may apply or may not apply depending on the case. Do you think that this will actually induce people to actually come forward and disclose some of their programs of the past few years?
Yeah, if you remember, there was actually something similar that was actually introduced in 2018-2019, and during 2018-2019, it was actually a special voluntary disclosure scheme for income tax.
That's right.
And definitely, a lot of companies actually did come forward to the tax authorities, to basically highlight that there was certain treatment technically which could have been incorrectly done, or they could have taken the opportunity to perhaps engage with the tax authorities on how some of these things should be treated. So there was actually working together with the tax authorities, and as a result of this income tax voluntary special disclosure, the government actually collected in addition of about 8 billion in revenue. So I think it is definitely a good move to have this special voluntary disclosure scheme for indirect taxes, because you'll find that if you see what happened in 2018-2019, taxpayers actually took the opportunity to actually come forward and have that, sort of like dialogue with the tax authorities.
All right, one last area before we conclude this, of course, is corporate tax. Based on the budget, corporate tax will still be the largest contributor at 65.5 billion. This is an increase of 8.1% from 2021. My worry is that corporates will continue to have or face issues in terms of achieving the targeted revenue for next year, but that's just my feeling. I'm not too sure whether you share my own sentiment. What's your thoughts on corporate tax and therefore corporate tax collection?
Yeah, I think you are right to say that, it's the government is actually projecting for things to improve in 2022, and hence that's why there's this view that corporate tax collection will move up. But if you look at the trend of actually what has been collected so far, the budget of 2021 for corporate tax collection was about 162 billion for both direct and indirect taxes. But to date, as of July 2021, only 91 billion has been collected. So I think on the back that the economy is going to improve next year, that's why the thinking that the corporate tax collection should be able to meet the targets. But don't forget, on top of that, all these additional taxes, when it comes to the 33% tax, we sort of like estimate that, that could actually have an additional impact of 4 to 5 billion, perhaps these 33% taxes. So from there, perhaps the government is thinking that they are able to collect this additional revenue. But I mean, you're right to say that we're not out of the woods yet as far as the pandemic is concerned. So if, let's say, the economy does not achieve the target, then obviously, corporate tax, there may be a bit of a challenge to meet the budget. That's why, to a certain extent, I feel that there needs to be a relook at the entire tax system and determine whether there's any other areas that the government can focus on and not just rely on corporate tax itself.
Yeah, but surely more tax does not necessarily mean more productivity. In fact, I just did an interview with Sunway Hotels, for instance, Sunway Hotel and Theme Park. He was arguing that for theme parks, for instance, and you charge 25% upon the ticket price of the theme park, that doesn't necessarily allow for theme park operators to actually use the funds at the ticket to, build better theme parks. That's just one example of a business proprietor very unhappy about the tax structure imposed or levied against them. And of course, generally speaking, you're right, tax is just something that not many people want to pay. I don't want to pay income tax, but eventually I have to pay, right? But the idea here is there a better way to move forward? What's your thought on this when it comes to the tax strategy and tax policy of the country in the near term?
Yeah, so like I mentioned earlier, it's an opportunity to reset, to review the entire tax structure and system in Malaysia. Like corporate tax is only one way. For example, if you have other types of taxes, like for example, the GST, then obviously you will need to reduce the corporate taxes. Or if you decide to have corporate tax collection still at that level, then how the tax collections are being invested, I think is also very important. So if the public can see that the tax being collected is being put into something useful and the projects are being well managed, then at least people can see what they are paying taxes for.
Right, fantastic. Jennifer, thank you very much. That was our conversation with Jennifer Chang, tax partner at PwC Malaysia. Of course, the conversation on Budget 2022 will still revolve across the week. There's still plenty to offer when it comes to Malaysian Parliament. There's still going to be debates there as well. But for now, that would be our episode for this evening. And if you've missed any part of this, just head on to astroawani.com. Look for Notepad over there. You can also look for PwC as well on top of our microsite Budget 2022. Until then, thanks very much for watching and goodbye.